tried to meet on the Tuesdays that I've been in town to try to share the information that we've been reading. I've tried to further collaborate the information that we've talked about in the past in regards to the relationship to secret societies, to the people that we know. And we hooked all of this into the schema of the New World Order, stating that basically in the black community there is no guidelines, there is no guideposts, there is no theory or thesis on the New World Order, so-called. The New World Order, so-called, is not a crime. Nobody commits a crime by being a part of the New World Order. Again, only when you hook those things to murder do you and the New World Order have a combination that can make a revolution. I witnessed tape this morning. I looked at a videotape that Brother Donald had provided for me. I thought was very informative of Brother Collard's lecture last week, and 2 weeks ago in Baltimore. And I really enjoyed Brother's dialogue about revolution. And many times you could really underestimate the knowledge that Brother Collard has as a brother who is a knowledgeable man on many things. And I know back in '92 we did the Revolution 101 lecture together for a brother who used to run around D.C. with us who went to Atlanta. Now he's in Houston somewhere. Brother Amin Ra. Right, I was going to say, what's that brother's name? He's trying to run for mayor in Houston now. He ran for mayor in Atlanta. Just a brother who we used to meet around here in D.C. And brother was very good into the science of thinking about the things you needed to do. And one of the themes he kept emphasizing was that you could not uphold and respect white law if you lived by and abided by black law. And it was a very powerful theme, and probably next week I'd like to put some of the tape on for you before the lecture because it was just very, very informative. And the brother has more knowledge than the community can extract from him. And I would really love to see Brother Collard institutionalized, where men could be trained by him. For them just to meet him only in a lecture is truly underestimating some of his strongest gifts as a teacher, as a disciplinarian, and as a scholar. So I was very pumped up. I spent most of the day watching that tape and appreciated it very, very much. Tonight, we're going to look a little bit deeper at the white revolution. What has happened last week and the week before last, week before that, I've tried to go into deeper information about sources and topics that we've had in the past. 3 weeks ago in the tape over there that's unnamed, it just says Steve Coakley. I think the date is 10/8/95. In that we read those memos that we got from 1919 where military intelligence in D.C. is trying to figure out what does the word boule mean. And we laughed because there were some intriguing viewpoints that they expressed as they tried to decodify it. Before we finish tonight, I'll read the one-page memo to you. But also, you remember there was disruption against the boule in 1919, where over 20,000 parents were preparing to mobilize against the boule's domination of the D.C. school system. And we know that was of significant impact because the boule has all these years later been able to negate the opposition against it, suggesting that it has never been adverse to its own people. But what we can find is that at key moments throughout history, they have been attacked and challenged. Even as late as '68 when they moved their convention out of Pittsburgh into Philadelphia because they felt that the black community and Kwame Ture were going to disrupt the '68 convention. We also looked at we started looking at some names, Carter G. Woodson, Roscoe Bruce, who was the man they were accusing of being the boule underhanded man, Kelly Miller, Durkee, the president here at Howard, the philanthropists, the Carnegies, the Phelps Stokes, the Sloans, the Rockefellers, etc., and their impact on all of these people that we have been looking at. All of this information only deeply verifies some things we had talked about in the past about the role that these secret societies have played. As I was reading an article from the South African, I don't even want to call it a tribunal, prayer session with those who bombed. I think that was another good point Brother Collard made. How could Mandela forgive them hunkies for blowing up black people, and then turned to Winnie Mandela and said, you committed an unforgivable sin. And we continuously plague each other with an unbearable standard. But with whites, we allow them on numerous occasions to do what we wouldn't take in a minute from another black. And I thought it was an excellent point that the brother had made. And in regards to the rebellion in St. Petersburg, I think he also made one other comment that was very effective. He said, when's it going to start being drive-bys at police stations? Drive-by is such a popular occupation. Why don't we start telling them different places where they could go to drive by? And it was very, very cogent, just excellent discussion. And we'll share it. Tonight, I want to talk to you about, and I'm going to break to introduce to you some of the people who are around the room, what things they have, and let them tell you why they brought those things and why I asked them to be here. I appreciate sharing the people we have with the people who have things that they want to share with other people. For this is what we always were. We got people now having meetings saying they can't have no vendors. They don't want nobody but their special only vendor, their one and only vendor, their person. And it really, I mean, we don't have much at any time, any of us, but our way we make that available for each of us is excessively important. What I'm going to try to put in place today is some stuff I was reading that made this suggestion that the white men who rose up to form the Rhodes Rothschild Secret Society, the Cecil Rhodes and the Milners and others, were what you call the landed wealthy or the landed rich or made men, as opposed to born men versus made men. Similarly, in America, the apparatus to the Rhodes Rothschild Secret Society that emerged in America were also made men. Rockefeller's daddy is a medicine man. He's a rapist. He's a child pornographer. He's all of these things, but his son is the head of the Rhodes Rothschild connection. That's not a born man, that's a made man. So we're looking at that this element of New World Order that we're fighting now is not the aristocracy. The aristocracy gave way to these men who were of meager means but of great vision. Rhodes sitting there listening to Ruskin. Ruskin impresses upon him a vision of the new world. And Rhodes gets up and goes off. Of course, Oxford, even at that day, wasn't a pittance university. It wasn't the lowest place you could be found at. So it wasn't necessarily non-fertile. It was fertile for the wealthy, but also there were commoners there. So we're really dealing with, in this phase of the New World Order, the emergence of the commoner who rose up to be the operational man, who eventually became respected as aristocracy. People now look at Rockefeller like aristocracy, but in the terms of being bred by hunkies, he's in cheap white. This is important because they compensated excessively for their lack of bornness by over-insulating themselves with things to give themselves a greater prop. I am the museum founder. I'm the art maker. I'm the dance payer. I'm the music financier. They took the symphony, took the museum, took those props and placed them around themselves. When we had stepped earlier, White Finance, Negro Leadership versus Garvey, and the theme was that blacks were not wealthy. So when blacks merged with whites, you had educated blacks merging with wealthy Jewish whites. And in that discussion, if you remember, it was about Rosenwald and the other Jewish philanthropists wanting to get with the born wealthy, the Carnegies, etc., the born wealthy, and wanting to get with them. They then created a role for themselves in terms of tending to the Negro. This role of tending to the Negro allowed the rich not to have contact with the Negro on a regular basis. It buffered for them. The original Jewish philanthropist assistance to New World Order was to buffer the blacks. The whites were also buffering themselves to the richer whites. And I'll get deeper into that with you. Also, the first president of Johns Hopkins University, Gilman, excellent brother. But you would want to know Gilman from his role as being the man who incorporated the Russell Trust, which was the caretakers to Skull and Bones. So the founder of Johns Hopkins, a man, wants to build a university like Harvard. They take 3 of the most prestigious presidents of college universities and form a committee to find who will be the man for Oxford. Of those 3 men, one of those men was in Skull and Bones. We're not talking about 1852. Skull and Bones started in 1832. So now you want a lower East Coast aristocratic university, and Gilman is selected to head Johns Hopkins. So now, when we go back into the blacks that became the men for the whites, you remember in last week's tape, we talked about Elaine Locke and how Elaine Locke was significant in that he was the only Rhodes Scholar for as long as he lived. And he was, from 1907 to 1953, he was the only black Rhodes Scholar, but on blood oath, he was guaranteed to be the only one. Now, in the past, I had discussed, and it was Brother Charles who told me this, that the Rhodes Scholar was in 63. This next Rhodes Scholar was in 63. I knew that there was this big gap between Elaine Locke, whose name and plaque as a Rhodes Scholar I learned by walking through the Hall of Howard. It's on the wall. And herein is the building named after the first black Rhodes Scholar. I didn't learn it. I just walked into it, not understanding the significance of Elaine Locke being singled out as hooked to the umbilical cord of the Rhodes Rothschild Secret Society. That it was no idle thing that a man was selected to stand out amongst all men as being divinely connected to a group of whites who were emerging away from the born whites. So this made white saw the need to make a black while he was making himself. So that the made men propped themselves up in many ways. The born man was separated from the bulk of the society. The reason the born man created social work was because, again, remember, we talked about the serfs being locked away on a certain part of the land. You leave the serfs there long enough, they figure out a way to get across. Remember, the king was in a castle. Around his castle, he put a moat. The only way you could get in the castle was to drop the drawbridge. Well, if you leave a poor man disrespected in a fence long enough, he'll figure out not only how to get out of the fence, get over the wall, but to get his ass up in that castle and kick your ass for disrespecting him.
That's right.
So then they created social work. The means by which you planted people inside the wall. And when rumblings like St. Petersburg get heard, you always have a social program just waiting. You always have a body of concerned citizens waiting to emerge, to be concerned at the appropriate moment in a climate of little or no concern. So now we can start to understand where all of these pieces fit in. As I now studied the last couple of nights back into Tragedy and Hope, and Bruce, who's been rereading it as I have, man, we could spend a month on this damn book. It's got so many layers of things in it. I was telling you earlier that some of the most proficient writers in the black community, Carter G. Woodson and many of the more famous black historians, many of our more famous black historians actually spoke their books. Carter G. Woodson wrote a large volume of information. Many of the other blacks that were our most proficient writers tended to read their books to people, and then they would transcribe. Sideline. Okay. Hey, what's up, Donald Brown, internationally known? Sure, you're right. I appreciate you, Baba. Check. Now, so that leads me to lead into this discussion. We still on side one?
No, second page. Yes,
Okay.
Second side.
I wanted to share with you a couple of things that I pulled up out of a couple of books that need to be into the record. I look back at Rockefeller in 1870, look back at Rhodes in 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920. This is the period where the need to make this Negro was decided on. The need for this Negro. Reconstruction was whites adjusting to Negro progress. Probably what we have witnessed, as I watched earlier before I came here, Willie Brown debating another man on C-SPAN over the second Reconstruction period. As they fight over affirmative action and other things, you're really in the second Reconstruction. You're in the period where whites have decided that black progress, as meaningless and frivolous as we know it to be, it has been projected so importantly. The white man in the need to project the image of the have a little, want some more Negro to other Negroes over-projected the Negro to other whites. Pissing off other whites by over-projecting this Negro beyond his value. Trying to impress the other Negroes, but pissed off the other whites. So whites are rebelling because they feel that they're in a stage where this black man is received too much. Now, when I look back at Cecil Rhodes and some of the things that I want to share with you today, one of the things I want you to remember is this, that Cecil Rhodes was one of the primary proponents of whether you be a Boer in South Africa or a native, as he called it, in Africa, or an Englishman. Liberal education was your way into the real world. A liberal education. Yes, that phrase. You see what that phrase brings about? Every one of these Negroes that I've been studying, whether it be Charles Wesley, whether it be Elaine Locke, whether it be Kelly Miller, whether it be Roscoe Bruce, whether it be Carter G. Woodson, whatever, their theme that they brought into Howard as an educational institution, the thing that was sold to the boule was that the liberal education. Now remember, this is a breakaway from Carter G. Woodson, Booker T. Washington coming forth with let's go with the vocational training. So now you got another group, the talented 10th Negroes coming forth, Du Bois and the others saying this vocational training and the use for agriculture or industry are of no need to us without a liberal education. So to know Greek, to know history, to know mathematics, to know the other sciences were of great importance to the emerging Negro, whose bill of goods was education. But Cecil Rhodes was the man who felt that if a man received this liberal education, even if he was a native, he could be with me. And interestingly enough, to show the racial bias of even Carol Quigley. Carol Quigley suggests that Rhodes was not a racist. That Rhodes was really a fair-meaning man. And at least what he wanted for the Africans was to civilize these savages in the way of an Englishman. Isn't that nice? And he thought that was benevolent. Now, one thing that is not in Quigley's book is the psychopathic nature of Cecil Rhodes' homosexuality. You see, you have to think, you can't measure this man without knowing his psychopathic, racial, sexual encounters he had with people who he murdered after he sexually abused them. And in the case, he had this one cliff that he would have sex in the butt with black men and push them over the cliff. For he never wanted the same man twice. Now imagine you down one man short in the diamond mines. You exploiting black people, and Rhodes is up there having sex, got a string of men getting ready to kick him over the cliff. Okay. Now, in in the South African story that's out now, where the South Africans are revealing crimes committed by people in the past. One of the things of interest is that there was a journalist. I just read a story about a white journalist who was considered a very liberal, fair-minded white journalist. But then when the tribunal came up, they found out that actually he was an informant. Now, this is the problem that black historians are having with us, is that when you evaluate Kelly Miller being the head of the first sociology department, say at Howard, say in 1907, they say Kelly Miller is the most influential man in all of education in the black community. When you got Kelly Miller talking about, well, you got Booker T on this side. In fact, brother bought me the book. Just show you how shit go. I'm reading some shit, and this is right while I'm reading it, I pick up the phone and call brother Donald, and I said, Donald, man, I just had to call you, man. I'm reading some shit about Kelly Miller, and Kelly Miller responded to the essays about the conservatives versus the radicals, and that this series of essays, the conservatives versus the radicals. In fact, I need to go to the videotape. The conservatives versus the radicals, and see if I can make some strong sense for you, because it's very significant in the long haul. Kelly Miller starts this false dichotomy. False dichotomy is you produce a conflict that is not real. Conflict that is not real. CIA drug story comes out, and I come here and tell you, I just watched CNN, and they're arguing over whether it's a liberal issue or a right-wing issue. That's not that type of issue. CIA drugs is not a liberal or a right-wing issue. That's a false dichotomy. Left-wing versus right-wing, liberal versus conservative. What's some of them other fake ones? Democrat, Republican. Good.
Integration.
Huh?
Integration.
Integration versus?
Segregation.
Well, we ain't had no primary segregationists. I guess in one sense, the integrationists were fighting. Yeah, I guess you could say that. That's good. That's real. That's real. Now, huh?
I was saying Roe versus Wade.
Roe versus Wade. Hey, Demoli, don't you start spanking people who talk like you used to talk. You be the sergeant at arms. Since our policeman brother isn't here tonight, you handle all people who say stuff like you used to say.
Sure, you're right.
You used to say it. You used to, brother. I told him, I said, look, man, I'm going to tell you, I told sister this, I told other people this. I used to have strange feelings about brother. When he first came around, he would say things. He'd like to say things in the middle of things. But he's gotten more disciplined, and I've come to respect him as a guy who's trying to do what he's trying to do. And I think in the long run, he's going to be one of the greatest warriors of our race. That this brother is going to, they keep pushing him up against the wall and all that stuff. This boy going to be fired up. I got to pay another policeman to bust him up next week and shit. He ain't going to do what I wanted him to do after I paid the last policeman. You know? The conservative versus the radical. Who's the conservatives? Booker T. Who's the radical?
Garbage.
No, that's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem. You got the problem. What's the problem? Is that when the... Let's see, I'm too big. Let me see here. What can I do? I can come close. Uh-oh. Whoa. There you go. Okay. That's the problem. Is that when you start a fight in the black community about the preferred black, if you end up like this, you got a problem. Ain't no Garvey on. Ain't no room for black nationalism or black Garvey or back to Africa. The radicals of Du Bois were not really radicals at all. The white laborites, the black laborites, the black labor, the black socialists, the black social welfare agents were all run by whites. The black labor come in with white labor. The black socialists got their money from white socialists. The white social welfare workers, the black social welfare workers, Du Bois and others, were put in NAACP Urban League by whites. The black conservatives, Booker T was financed by Rockefeller. Some of the more prominent are Andrew Carnegie. Whites financed the black conservatives of those days.
Still do.
Still do. So what do? You have an argument over none of the above. You got no standalone black in the dichotomy. So when Kelly Miller, I asked the brother, I said, man, I'm reading this thing on Kelly Miller. And so he says, brother. He says, brother. I got it. He said, brother. He said, man, you know your favorite bookseller. He said, I got the book. Radicals and Conservatives and Other Essays on the Negro in America by Kelly Miller. That brother Donald. Let's give Donald a hand, man. I'm scared of the brother. He knows some good stuff. He knows good stuff. Of course, the Agnew book, Go Quietly or Else.
Well,
that's an important book. Do it say ... Hey, you may have somebody to do this. ... All right, we're working it up. The book that Dan Rather wrote that talks about how he missaw the Kennedy assassination, and that the camera didn't blink, but he sure did.
That's right.
And that's his book, The Camera Never Blinks. And that's how he got on the evening news for misreading the Kennedy assassination. And November 17th and 24th, I don't know what those Tuesdays are, but those 2 Tuesdays I'm going to be doing Kennedy assassination and the New World Order. So you'll want to hear that. That'll be coming up in November. But this is the Kelly Miller book. It says Kelly Miller is one of the dominant intellectuals of black America from the turn of the century to the 1930s. In 1934, Miller retired from his alma mater, Howard University, after long and distinguished membership, first in mathematics, then as a professor of sociology, and from 1907 to 1918 as dean of the college. He died in 1939. Now, Kelly Miller, interestingly enough, who was the first founder of Johns Hopkins? Gilman. Now let's go to the book over here. Man, this shit scares me. I swear to God, this shit is scaring me. Go to the book, America's Secret Establishment, an introduction into the Order of Skull and Bones by Anthony Sutton. Well, in this book, Sutton has a chapter on what's called the Baltimore Scheme. The Baltimore Scheme. That Skull and Bones walked out of New Haven. You all remember the man, Colonel House?
Right.
The man who was, you know where he's from? He's from New Haven, Connecticut. And all his famous books come up out of New Haven. Colonel House hung out at Yale. Woodrow Wilson's Henry Kissinger. Woodrow Wilson being the first president ever to make a foreign trip. Up until that point, no American president had ever left America. Well, there was no way to leave. He went on a ship. That was the first part to get on and said, how can I go back to Europe? He said, well, you can't take a plane, pal. You can't watch it on TV. So anyway, Daniel Gilman becomes president of Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins, a wealthy Baltimore merchant, left his fortune to establish a university for graduate education, the first in the United States along German lines, and a medical school. In fact, they probably got a hospital up there.
Yep.
They do.
Oh, shit.
The best in the world, they say. They say it's the best
Known for
in the world. They say.
Known for killing like
That's where they
Tuskegee.
did separate those Siamese twins. That
Up there,
doctor,
John Hopkins.
Johnson.
The black brother.
The brother.
Black brother.
Okay. Okay. All right. Daniel Gilman, Hopkins trustees were all friends who lived in Baltimore. How then did they come to select Daniel Coit Gilman as president of the new university?
He was doing some strange stuff in California, wasn't he?
Right, Gilman was in very good, Ty. Good shit, brother. Gilman was the president of the University of California, having left Yale and been sent to set up schools in California. Anyway, Gilman. I don't know how this is coming on.
Yeah.
Kelly Miller to Gilman. Gilman says in 1874, the trustees invited 3 university presidents to come to Baltimore and advise on the choice of a president. They were Charles Eliot of Harvard, Andrew Dickerson White of Cornell, and James Angle of Michigan. Only Dickerson White was in the order of Skull and Bones. After the meeting, independently, each of these presidents selected unanimously Daniel Gilman. In 1867, Gilman received an offer as president of the University of Wisconsin. He declined. In 1872, Gilman was offered the presidency of the newly established University of California, and that offer he accepted. Now, let's go backwards. Let me go backwards on Gilman. There's one thing up here about Gilman I want to make sure I read to you. And interesting in this book, one of the key people who is the LaRoches, one of the key people that Lyndon LaRoche honors is a man named Frederick Schiller.
Right.
And remember here on page 79, they show that Frederick Schiller was an associate of Adam Weishaupt. Frederick Schiller, 1759 to 1805, was known in the circle, but not reliably recorded as an Illuminati member. He was in and this is a section called the Illuminati Connection, and the role that he had. What I wanted to tell you is that Gilman was instrumental in writing the legislation, instigating the writing of the legislation as a student coming out of Yale to make the land grant colleges. The land grant. You know, what is Howard? What is Morgan? Oh, no. So what am I saying is that the idea that you would grab this land and build schools came out of Yale. Out of a known Skull and Bones man, the desire to start making education available to on a limited basis to some of the masses as a tool to develop preferred leadership. Says Gilman wrote the Land Grant College Act. Bill now knows land donated to public lands for state colleges of agriculture and sciences. Of course, Gilman's report, and Gilman grabbed up the land for Connecticut and for Massachusetts. He was very instrumental in doing that. Daniel Coit Gilman is a key activist in the revolution of education by the order. The Gilman family came to the United States from Norfolk, England in 1638. On his mother's side, the Coit family came from Wales to Salem, Massachusetts in 1638. Gilman was born in Norwich, Connecticut, July 8, 1831, from a family laced with members of Skull and Bones and links to Yale College, as it was known at that time. Uncle Henry Coit Kinsley, Skull and Bones, 1834, was the treasurer of Yale from 1862 to 1886. James I. Kinsley was Gilman's uncle and was a professor at Yale. William N. Kinsley, a cousin, was editor of the influential New Englander Journal. On the Coit side of the family, Joshua Coit was a member of the Skull and Bones in 1853. What year did it start?
1853.
What year did Skull and Bones start?
1832.
Okay. As well as William Coit in 1887. Gilman's brother-in-law, the Reverend Joseph Parrish Thompson, 1838, Skull and Bones. Gilman returned from Europe in the late 1855 and spent the next 14 years in New Haven, Connecticut, almost entirely in and around Yale, consolidating the power of the Skull and Bones. His first task in 1856 was to incorporate Skull and Bones as a legal entity under the name of the Russell Trust. Gilman became treasurer, and William H. Russell, the co-founder, was president. It is notable that there is no mention of the Order of Skull and Bones, the Russell Trust, or any other secret activity in Gilman's biography, now nor in open records of Skull and Bones as far as its members are concerned. So it designated him to be secret and apart from one of two inconsequential slips, meaningless unless one has the whole picture. The order has been remarkably adept at keeping it secret. In other words, the order fulfills its first requirement for a conspiracy. It is secret. Then it goes on to describe Gilman's role in setting out the land-grant colleges as pictures of others of his relatives and the role that they had over the course of years in being powerhouses at Yale. Now, Gilman comes and stars John Hopkins. One of Gilman's primary people that he trained was Thomas Dewey.
Education.
The one world Dewey. Dewey was the one world candidate. The one world man, Rockefeller's man. Dewey was Rockefeller's man. But Dewey was the Dewey Decimal System. The original way by which every book fit a category in a library.
NAACP, too.
NAACP, Dewey was one of the founding members. Dewey was on the board of Foreign Policy Association with Jane Addams. One of the first blacks to write for Foreign Affairs was who? W.B. Du Bois. What is the other organization like Foreign Affairs that produces a magazine called Foreign Policy?
Carnegie Institute.
Carnegie puts it out. The Carnegie Institute for International Peace puts out what magazine?
Foreign Policy.
Foreign Policy. Now we know that Du Bois was the first person ever to write for Foreign Affairs. So who's the first person ever to write for Foreign Policy? Kelly Miller. Kelly Miller is the first person ever to write for Foreign Policy Association. So now what we have found are the first bringing forth of blacks to serve the New World Order. That blacks were finally being, shall we say, watched close enough that they could be brought in without feelings of disruption. Now I want to bring you some other evidence as linkage. 1890-something, John Hopkins, Robert, don't have no black students. Who's the first black student to go to John Hopkins? Personally invited and tended to by the president, Daniel Gilman.
Kelly Miller.
Kelly Miller. Kelly Miller. So now we got Hopkins being a product of Skull and Bones, Gilman being a product of Skull and Bones. Gilman goes and gets the first black student, Kelly Miller. Now, that shit gets intriguing because, of course, we know Boule was set up on the tenets of what? Skull and Bones at Yale and Phi Beta Kappa. Who was the first person to set up Phi Beta Kappa at a black university in America? Brought Phi Beta Kappa to Howard.
Well, no.
Elaine Locke. Elaine Locke was the first one to bring Phi Beta Kappa to Howard. Phi Beta Kappa, remember, at that time was a Masonic secret society, not an honor society as you know it now.
That's right.
Anyway, the point of this is that though we have always known the umbilical cord from the Boule to the whites, what we're in effect doing now is filling in the blanks, picking up every linkage and detail, working them into their direct relationship with whites, showing direct impact. Kelly Miller is propagated all over, not just America, but in England. Who is it? I know you wouldn't know the answer, but when I gotta go. Let me go to Carol quickly. I do this right by going to Carol quickly. I need to go over to Quigley, and I want you to hear this that Quigley was saying. Quigley is now talking about Rhodes and Rothschild, and Rosebery replaced his father-in-law, Lord Rothschild, in Rhodes' secret group and was made a trustee under Rhodes' next and last will. Rosebery tried to obtain a route for Rhodes' railway to the north across the Belgian Congo. Rosebery also informed of Rhodes' plan to finance an uprising of the English against the Boers and sent Dr. Jameson on a raid in that country to restore order. And finally, Rhodes found the money to finance Kitchener's railway from Egypt to Uganda using the South African gauge and engines given by Rhodes. The economic strength which allowed Rhodes to do these things rested in the diamond and gold mines. Anyway, it goes on to say this: in spite of the terms of Rhodes' will, this is Quigley apologizing for the white supremacist attitudes of Rhodes. In spite of the terms of Rhodes's will, Rhodes himself was not a racist, nor was he a political Democrat. He worked as easily and closely with Jews, black natives, or Boers as he did with English. But he had a passionate belief in the value of a liberal education and was attached to a restricted suffrage and even to non-secret ballot. In South Africa, he was a staunch friend of the Dutch and of the blacks and found his chief political support among the Boers until at least 1895 and wanted restrictions on natives put on educational rather than color bases. These ideas have generally been held by his group since and have played an important role in British imperial history. Well, you see, that's a contradiction there. Imperialism is disrespect for other people. It's a form of colonialism. You can't be an imperialist. You can't be an imperialist integrationist. You know, that's a contradiction. So I want you to appropriately remember that Quigley had nothing against anything that Rhodes did and Rothschild. This is not an expose. This is almost a laudatory comment about them as opposed to an expose. And it says, his greatest weakness rested in the fact that his passionate attachment to his goals made him overly tolerant in regard to methods. He did not hesitate to use either bribery or force to attain his ends if he judged that they would be effective. This weakness led to his greatest errors. Now, interestingly enough, in reading about the Rockefellers, the founding of the Rockefeller dynasty and money in the Rockefeller Syndrome by Ferdinand Lundberg, who also wrote The Rich and the Super Rich. Rockefeller himself did not drink. The old man was a fornicator, child molester, medicine man. The son did not drink, did not smoke, did not go for any form of entertainment. It was only Bible reading and oil. Junior. Bible reading and oil. So, but it says that though he was a strict moralist, he would bribe the railroads to not allow his competitors to get a favorable rate. He would secretly buy up the competition and not let the public know that he owned all sides of the same coin. So he's called a moralist, but admitted he used devious devil techniques to accomplish his goals. So now, what are we confronted with here? Rhodes is an imperialist, but a fair man. No, we're... What do you call this? Forked tongue. That whites can speak on both sides on the same thing, be diametrically opposed to each other, and find nothing wrong with having both opposites.
Right.
Cecil Rhodes, he said that Rhodes, well, his original statement was that Rhodes was an important man because his money left money to form an education, and that he was able to get an education for free because of Cecil Rhodes. Then we said, well, wasn't Rhodes a white supremacist, imperialist, and everything else? And his comment had something to do with the fact that you're not going to judge a man's motivations or mode of operation, are you? He accomplished great things for the English-speaking world. But now, interestingly enough, remember I said last week that Alain Locke was a primary promoter of blacks becoming English speakers all over the world because he felt it was the destiny of the English-speaking Western world to run the world. Therefore, blacks had to be best prepared under the dominant culture. But that sounds similar to Jesse Jackson. How will we make it to the year 2000, Robert? Necessary. And that sounds similar to the relationship that Du Bois saw for the talented 10th. The necessary role. Anyway, point being is that these made men who were not born men never ever passed up an opportunity to fuck somebody for money.
Right.
So whatever you know about them now, you must know about them then.
Right.
How they got what they got ain't what they look like now. Even though they do it now, they're just more sophisticated. Now, Cecil Rhodes was very good at running the world because he had a #1 PR man. You might know who the PR man was for Cecil Rhodes. This man was a part of the Round Table group. He was the editor of the Times of London. No, not the editor now, the editor. Now remember, what's the boy, Edward R. Murrow was a writer. He's the actual writing man. Let's go, who was the PR man for George Washington? Now let's go back. George Washington is the 9th president. But now they got to tell America he's the first one. George Washington, when wasn't nobody respecting his leadership, his PR man pumped him up in a way that made other people respect him. Ben Franklin. There we go. Yeah. So, you might not know who the PR man was for Cecil Rhodes, but I'm going to tell you that Cecil Rhodes' PR man was a man named W.T. Steed.
William Steed.
William Steed.
Rewrote the history of the world.
Rewrote the history of the world. There you go. But now, when it's decided that the false dichotomy of Kelly Miller has to get around Europe, it's decided, W.T. Steed decides that Kelly Miller should be running every week in the Times in London in 1911, 1910, 1913. So Kelly Miller becomes one of the more influential men in the world. But his trumpet Kelly Miller becomes one of the most influential men in the world, and it's because of his relationship to white men that the white men extended him the privilege. Daniel Gilman personally picks him up and gets him in to be the first Negro at Johns Hopkins, and Kelly Miller says as long as he was at Johns Hopkins, he never met racial discrimination, racial animosity. He said he was treated in a cultured and calculated way. That's his quote, cultured and calculated way. Cultured and calculated, meaning that they was going to pump the nigga up. They wasn't in there to bust him down. They was in there to pump him up.
That sound like LBJ and Rhodes.
Yeah, I got me a nigga. Now, he's a good nigga. I took him around the world with me. This is in last week's tape. We're talking about LBJ picking up Carl Rowan and asking the senators to vote for him, or at least don't vote against him. Don't denut him. Don't denut him because he said he's a good nigger. He said, I got one problem. He's a nigger. So I got one problem. He's a nigger. He said, but he does what I ask him. He does what I tell him. He does what I tell him. Yep. David Rockefeller and Randall. David Rockefeller and Whitney Young. Yeah. Who he put at the head of the Urban League. That's right. To put him in the action arena. Huh? And then killed him when he wanted to go to Africa. With your boy Jesse Watson. Right, your boy Jesse, right? You've been to Jesse's house, right? Yes, sir. With Mandela too, right? And what happened when you asked Mandela he or heard Steve Coakley?
He said, yeah, give me the tape, man, give me the tape.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah, Jesse had Mandela over his house, and Malik and Hebrew and all them was over there. Yeah, right back here on T Street. Anyway, I want you to know that. Now, let me go back to another part. This is Ruskin. This is England coming forth with what they want to have known in the public as they're now coming forth with what Quigley calls new imperialism. New imperialism. And he describes a period where Britain was dominant in Europe because they had the control of the waterway. That the British, the way the Britain Island laid out over Europe, they were the last things you had to deal with coming out of Europe. So they were very influential amongst the other whites on sea power. So that as wars developed over the colonial properties, Britain became the dominant colonizer because of their ability to do two things. This is what Britain did. Britain had decided, the king and the queen said, look, these fucking colonies, this colonizing these niggas is expensive. No, this is what they said. It's right in here. Said this is important development in the world. This colonizing niggas is really getting expensive. So I'll tell you what we do. We're not going to colonize no more of these people. The French start giving back colonies. The Germans start giving back colonies. In many cases, the British were trying to pick these colonies up. But the problem was that they couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford to keep control of them. Soon as you got one, someone else would come and take it from you. And someone would take it from them. And then the so-called natives would take it back from all of them. And then this thing got expensive. So what they started the process of sending individuals would go out and say, look, well, fuck England. You ain't got to go down there and get Africa. I'm going to drive my ass to the lake in the middle of Africa, and I'm going to call it Lake Victoria. Remember that movie we talked about, the moon something? What was it, the moon? Huh?
The mountain of the moon. The mountain of the moon.
Mountains of the Moon, where it's a movie looking at the fight between Livingston and this Englishman and this Belgian dude, Leopold. All of them are fighting for who would get to the mouth of the Nile first. Right. And so they even started to make up. So I was at the mouth of the Nile, when in fact it was the other guy who had one leg and one arm, who got bit up by crocodiles and shit. But the point of it was that what sent Cecil Rhodes and Rothschild, Lewis and Clark, and the rest of the white explorers into what we call what do you call them when the stock market go real fast? A bull market. What sent their stock up so high was that the countries could no longer afford colonialism, so the individuals financed their own expeditions. Remember, Columbus begs the queen to give him some money so he'd go steal some shit for her. So when he first come back, the queen kicks his ass. Said, you ain't come back here with shit but 3 Indians. Now you better get your ass over there and go get it. He said, look, I saw the shit, and I brought the Indians to tell you about the shit I saw, but you gotta let me out of jail so I can go back and get this shit. She said, now look, I'm gonna let your ass out of here, but if you don't come back here with this shit, I'm kicking your ass. that started the process. But, let's go back. So all these years later, after the colonialism starts to expand, it starts to retreat because of the inability to finance it. So as John Ruskin inspires these students in the spirit of new imperialism, that you should go and take the land. Don't just take the new imperialism was, don't just take the land to kick a nigga in the ass. That's no fun. You get tired of kicking niggas in the ass. Kick the nigga's ass and then educate them, civilize them, make them Englishmen. Now that's a moral journey. So they immorally impregnated the devil with a moral journey. Immorally impregnated the devil with a moral journey. Remember, they created the myth of superior white people. They couldn't find these superior white people, so it was Atlantis, something mysterious under the water, that if only they came to the new world, they could experience this superior white person who was somewhere under the water, never seen by other white people. Again, we keep coming back to the role that the myth and the make-believe story played in real life. So, part of this is about the story we got to make up. We got to make up a story. And we're going to make up this story, and it's going to be a true story. But we're going to make it up. Anyway, we'll talk more about that later. Now, so Rhodes is now moving into this era where the landed class, old boy makes a point of picking up the role of the British imperial crisis, Africa, Ireland, and India to 1926. The empire was acquired by private individuals and commercial firms and was taken over by the British government much later. The Britain acquired the greatest empire because it possessed certain advantages of what other countries lacked. We mentioned 3 of these advantages. 1 was it was an island, 2, that it was in the Atlantic, and 3, that the social traditions at home produced the will and the talents for imperialistic acquisition. The social traditions at home produced the will for imperial acquisition. It was will. You will accomplish what you will. Right. It's like Garvey gave a speech at Oxford or something. Anyway, he goes on to talk about the rise of the landed gentry. As a result of the kings of England were unable to prevent the landed gentry from taking over control of the government in the period between 1642 and 1690. And the kings of England became constitutional monarchs. Britain's security behind her navy allowed this struggle to go to a decision without an important outside interference, and permitted rivalry between monarch and aristocracy, which would have been suicidal on the insecure grounds of continental Europe. Britain's security combined with the political triumph of the landed oligarchy to create a social tradition entirely unlike that on the continent of Europe. One result of these two factors was that England did not attain a bureaucracy such as appeared on the continent. This lack of a separate bureaucracy loyal to the monarch can be seen in the weakness. Remember we talked about last week how the Americans were afraid of the political machines in America because the political machine stopped the rich from controlling the localities, because patronage, the giving of jobs to those who served your political machine, made the loyalty to the machine and not the rich. The machine was a political tool of the poor. Ghetto risers, Jews, Tammany Hall, Italians, Irish, took over Chicago, New York, Philly. These Italian, Irish, or ghetto risers who developed political machines were a threat to the aristocracy. Eventually, as now, the aristocracy destroyed the political machine, and there's not one single political machine in any city in this country right now. Right now, there are no. And term limits is a tool as old as the protocol.
Right.
Saying the way you will break up political fiefdom that will interfere with the rich is to have term limitations. That's in the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Fact or fiction, in 1904 to call some shit out that they doing in 94 and 95 is profound.
Watch that we constant on Chicago radio is daily having this political machine. Daily
Just a myth, brother. Believe me, dumbass Daily of Chicago is controlled by corporate Chicago. Totally controlled by corporate Chicago. And I can prove it to you by showing the same corporations harass and attack Harold Washington. The same corporations gave the money to Daily. So that Daily would, they gave Daily the convention. They gave Daily many of these things to build them up. And again, I've told Chicago, and it's those of you who have the What's Up Chicago tape, which I don't have over there. I told the only thing that Daily got going in Chicago is political tranquility. As soon as that shit gets on edge, your hunky's going to fire Daily. And that I was going to be the one to instigate violence, this instability, and other negative activity in Chicago to make the whites have to fire his ass. And that I would do that. I would be committed to do that. I also am committed to do this, that as we've increased our power on these historically black campuses, the one that has gotten away from us is Howard. And that I asked a brother, pardon me? Teach on that. The point of it was that Howard needs a good ass kicking. And that any of you who are interested in working on the Howard Task Force, what this involves is that we will start a series of open letters to Howard. One of them deals with the history of Colonel Howard. It'll also deal with the names on the buildings, will be part 2. Locke, Thurkel, who was the white president from 07 to 12, Just Hall. We're going to walk them around to let them know that the history of this college has always been up for debate as to whether it would be relevant to blacks or relevant to white. The Moreland Spingarn Library, which was developed by Kelly Miller, who went to Jesse Moreland in 1914 and asked him to give his collection of African books, the biggest collection of African books in America, to Howard University. Now, we need to go in there now and see if the shit is still there. But and that was the start of what became, they wanted to build a museum and archive for blacks at Howard. And it eventually resulted in the Moreland Spingarn Library. That's how the library got going and got built. Anyway, just to show you that all of these things lead back to these same and key people. So now these people are rising up. In fact, this class, the landed class in England, just because they obtained control of the bar and the bench and were thus in a position to judge all disputes about real property in their own favor, control of the courts and of Parliament made it possible for this ruling group in England to override the rights of the peasants in land, to eject them from the land, to enclose the open fields of the medieval system, to deprive the cultivators of their rights and thus reduce them to the conditions of landless rural laborers or tenants. This advance of the enclosure movement in England made possible the agricultural revolution, greatly depopulated the rural areas in England and provided a surplus of population for the cities and mercantile and the marine and for overseas colonization. In other words, how they got the crew to go out to colonize, the men who left their country to go and colonize, they were chased off their farms. Chased off their farms, they ran to the cities. In the cities, there was no work, except for to jump on a boat and be a colonialist. So they were able to shape the job structure. Again, the cotton fields go bad. The blacks we talked about last week. The Great Migration, the cotton fields go bad. Industry sends agents to the South. The agents in the South want to pay for blacks to come north, and the Great Migration goes out. Again, while you were on last week's tape, we talk about the Great Migration. We go into Quigley at that period. We go over to those who met with the whites, the moment that Spingarn got the 32,000 names over to military intelligence, the letters back and forth between Von de Man and C.V. Ronan and Moulton, who replaced Booker T at Tuskegee. Anyway, I want to say this into the record so that I don't miss it. The landed oligarchy which arose in England differed from the landed aristocracy of continental Europe in 3 points already mentioned. 1, it got control of the government. 2, it was not opposed to a professional army, a bureaucracy, or a professional judicial system, but on the contrary, it took over control of these adjuncts of government itself, generally serving without pay and making access to these positions difficult by outsiders by making such access expensive. Yes, it's all right to have a professional military. Do we have a professional military now?
Yes.
Is the professional military run by a military man?
No.
No. By law. The Defense Department cannot be run by a military man. It must be run by a what? Civilian. What did that mean? That the rich set up and said, well, fuck. Rich said this, remember, all the conquering of countries was done by militaries. These military men were militaries. Go back to the movie Braveheart or Rob Roy. Look at these medieval movies where they're fighting. One army grabs some land and the king and queens are stealing lands of other kings and queens. And so you got this, Arthur develops the Round Table. The first professional fighting crew. Well, I guess the Crusaders were similar. Professional fighting crews. Crusaders for Christianity. King Arthur develops the Round Table by ritual to fight for the king. But it was a professional army, but the king still ran it. So now as kings wane, they look up and say, you know, we ain't going to be a king long if we don't have an army, but I ain't got time to run the damn army. So let's have a professional army, but let's leave someone of our flock in control of it. And that's exactly what we have right now in America still. And it obtained complete control over the land, as well as politics, religion, and social control of the villages. In addition, the landed oligarchy of England was different from that on the continent because it was not of nobility. This lack was reflected in 3 important factors. On the continent, a noble excluded from marrying outside his class or from engaging in commercial enterprise, moreover, access to nobility by persons of non-noble birth was very difficult. This goes back to why we know it was Sir Francis Bacon that wrote William Shakespeare rather than William Shakespeare, because if you wasn't of noble stock, you couldn't relate with noble stock. You couldn't even talk to them. Still today, if you come before so-called hunky Prince Charles, you're not allowed to look in his eyes. Your head remains tilted until he allows you to lift it, and you can't speak to him until what? He speaks to you first. So, nobility had a problem because just by mere nobility, they were excluded from the majority of the population. So the rise of this landed class, or made men, were the first to be able to marry all over the place. A made man could marry into a rich family, or he could marry a pauper's family. But nobility could only marry other nobility. So that's why nobility got weaker over time, because it failed to adapt due to exclusivity. But then again, you got the laws of England prop up nobility today. It's in the law that before the Congress meets, the Parliament meets, the Queen opens up the Parliament and shit. You know, it's in the law now. They're fixed in there. That even though, and the fact that they aren't allowed commerce and other things is still real. There ain't no king-queen novelty shop. They're blocked out of many things. So the landed, it says the non-noble birth, access to nobility by persons of non-noble birth was very difficult and could hardly be achieved in much less than 3 generations. In England, the landed oligarchy could engage in any kind of commerce or business and could marry anyone without question. Moreover, while access to gentry in England was a slow process which might require generations of effort acquiring land holdings in a single locality, access to peerage by act of government took only a moment. So you could make Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, in a moment ceremony. So remember, in England you had the House of what?
Lord.
And the House of Commons. Or the Senate and the Congress. Or the Round Table and the Boule. There you go. You understand this stair-staggered need for hierarchy of authority. Now, I'm telling you all most of what I read, I'm telling it to you. The details of these things are very well laid here. While the landed upper class of England was unable to become nobility, that is, caste beyond exalted birth, it was able to become aristocracy. So when brother brings me the book, he said, you can use my book, Aristocracy of Color. Aristocracy of Color. Brother let me use his book. He said I could use his book till he found another one. About the black rich, the aristocracy of color. Again, aristocracy being something you could achieve, but nobility was birth only. Aristocracy of color, the black elite, 1880 to 1920. This is very, very important. We have tried to follow through these key personalities and the things that these personalities did that made them important to us. Remember last week we mentioned that when Alain Locke went to Oxford, he formed, what did he form, Juan? What did Alain Locke form when he got to Oxford with the other emerging African leaders?
ASU.
AUS. How's AUS?
Oh, African Unity, African Union Society.
Hey, there you go. Look at that. African Union Society. Excellent, excellent, excellent. I know y'all know the stuff. See them outstanding minds? Brother gonna just remember some shit. I know Alain Locke said some shit. Because we gotta find out something about that. The African. I read the John Ruskin stuff today. And I see its depth, it's deep, and I gotta talk to you about whoever that is that puts that on there. Because I see they're esoteric, like, you know, they see different platitudes, and they played him up like a great moralist as well, too. I was intrigued by that. and Elaine Locke formulated the African Union Society. The society's constitution said that it was to be a medium for cultivating thought and social intercourse between its members as prospective leaders of the African race. Now, again, that dichotomy that Kelly Miller was so profound at skipped out Marcus Garvey. And by skipping out Garvey, it says as early as 1912, he had supported the proposals of Kelly Miller and Elaine Locke that instruction and research on Africa and the American Negro be encouraged by the board. This is by the Moreland is stressing to the board of Howard that they should extend Kelly Miller and Elaine Locke's thinking all throughout Africa. Now remember, way back when we did White Finance Negro Leadership versus Garvey, remember that the white man, part of how Carter G. Woodson got in trouble with the white philanthropists was that he fought against a position paper written by a white man that suggested how education should be set up in Africa. And the white man had said that the education in Africa ought to be on the Booker T. Washington vocational model. And what made this white man fought by Carter G. Woodson and the others were that they felt it should be quote-unquote liberal education. Of course, eventually Carter G. Woodson wrote The Miseducation of the Negro. W.B. Du Bois became disgruntled and called the Boule a hoax and a fraud. Even Kelly Miller, at the end of World War I, felt that the Negro still being lynched. We know we talked about the role of lynching last week. That lynching was interfering with the Negro moderates' ability to sell Negroism to the bulk of the Negro people. As long as they were being lynched, as long as they were being burned and other things.
Along with your point on education in Africa, you haven't mentioned this man's name, and he's another Professor Howard, is Hansberry.
Leo Hansberry.
And Hansberry,
got him right
Hansberry
here. Worked for Marcus Garvey.
Pushed that African studies up at Howard, and they knocked it down for 40 years. Would not put that program into Howard, not until later on, and they back into the student rebellions and stuff. They got African studies at Howard.
Remember when African studies, we said last week, it came in 1959. First person to propose African studies to Howard in 1909 was Elaine Locke. That African studies should be a part of the curriculum, and proposed it to no avail. Eventually,
Hansberry
was very instrumental.
He was a European educator, I think. But he pushed it. His daughter wrote, Lorraine Hansberry wrote Raising the Sun.
But what many people don't know is that Hansberry was one of the main writers for Marcus Garvey. That Hansberry broke from the elite crowd and went with the African crowd. And that's important. And in his profile here, this book is really excellent. You know, we left here last week, I was kidding Hebrew, and I didn't bring the TV VCR because it's just such a hassle. If anybody would love to start bringing a TV VCR, I'd appreciate it, but bringing the overhead and the family and everything, it's a lot of work to bring it all in here and to set it all up for a lecture. But this Dictionary of American Negro Biography by Logan and Winston. I was kidding you last week about Michael Winston and talk about his daughter named what? His daughter named Sherry Winston. Well, we left the lecture last week. I went home, sitting up. I'm up 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, still trying to detox off the lecture. I go home and figure out all the shit I didn't get in the lecture. Say, I fucked up again tonight. I didn't get that in, But I went home, turned on BET Jazz program. There's Lou Rawls interviewing this black guy, and the black guy says, and I got signed by Atlantic. The lady with Lou Rawls asked him who you get signed with. So I got signed by Atlantic by Sylvia Rhone. And that Sylvia Rhone gave me full artistic approval. You remember the brother's name? Who was the artist? He's a clarinetist. Anyway, the other person, you know, like Hubert Laws and all that, you know. No, it's black jazz. It's jazz, it's BT, this jazz brother. He played with everybody. He was on all of the major black jazz albums. He was in on it. And then with Quincy Jones, he's been with all these people. Huh? Leo Davis? Davis, yeah, something like that. Leo Davis or something like that. Anybody a jazz person? Anyway. Huh? She came out? Where'd she go? She went that way? She was that way? Okay. All right. But they're interviewing this guy with Lou Rawls was Sherry Winston. The lady who I told you last week Hebrew used to talk about, used to be trying to go freaking with or something. But sure enough, get right home and there she is on TV, but I taped it. So I'm going to show you Sherry Winston when we come in here next week. Right. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. It says upper-class Englishmen would ultimately be submerged by these majorities and the tradition lost. To prevent this, the tradition must be extended to the masses and to the empire. The new imperialism after 1870 was quite different in tone from that which the Little English had opposed earlier. The chief changes were that it was justified on grounds of moral duty and of social reform, not as earlier on grounds of missionary activity and material advantage. The man most responsible for this change was John Ruskin. Until 1870, there was no professorship of fine arts at Oxford, but that year, thanks to Slade's bequest, John Ruskin was named to the chair. He hit Oxford like an earthquake, not so much because he talked about fine arts, but because he talked about the empire and England's downtrodden masses, and above all, because he talked about all three of these things on moral issues. Until the end of the 19th century, the poverty-stricken masses of England lived in want, ignorance, and crime, very much as they were described by Charles Dickens. Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of the magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, self-discipline, and that this tradition could not be saved or did not deserve to be saved unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself and to non-English speaking masses throughout the world. If this precious tradition were not extended to these two great majorities, the minority of upper-class Englishmen would ultimately be submerged by these majorities and the tradition lost. So we got to get control of the masses, give them a little education to control them forever, for if we don't, they'll rise up and kick our ass. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa and rose to be prime minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896, contributed money to political parties and controlled parliamentary seats in both England and South Africa, and sought to win a strip of British territory across Africa from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line and ultimately with Cape to Cairo Railroad. Rhodes inspired devotion, support from his goals from others in South Africa and in England, and with financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bett, was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines, and to build a great gold mining enterprise as Consolidated Goldfields. In the middle of 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million a year, about $5 million, and spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his bank account. For these purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking people and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin had wanted. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends, including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred, later Lord Milner, Arthur Gazelbrook, George, later Sir George Parkin, Philip Littleton Gale, and Henry, Sir, later Henry Birchenough. These were so moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out their ideals. A similar group of Cambridge men, including Reginald Brett, Lord Esher, John B. Seeley, and Albert Gray, and Edmund Garrett, also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to the extension of the British Empire and the uplift of England's urban masses as two parts of one project which they called the extension of the English-speaking ideal. They were remarkably successful with these aims because England's most sensational journalist, William T. Stead, 1849 to 1912, an ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought them into association with Rhodes, and this association was formally established on February 5th, 1891. So the forming of the Rhodes Rothschild secret society was instigated by Steed, an imperialist, bringing Rhodes together with the students, other students at Cambridge who were inspired by Ruskin. So basically what that says is that Steed, an imperialist, took in to Kelly Miller, a supposed anti-imperialist. But in fact, none of them were. For all of them took money from the blacks took money from Carnegie, Rockefeller, Phelps, Stokes, Pew, all of them, and all of them were imperialists and white supremacists. And the last thing it says that in 1891, February 5th, when Rhodes and Steed organized the secret society. So now we have to elevate Steed to being with Rhodes for the organization of this secret society. This association was formally established February 5th, 1891, when Rhodes and Steed organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming of for 16 years. In this secret society, Rhodes' executive committee, Alfred Lord Balfour, who wrote the Balfour Declaration, Sir Harry Johnson, Lord Rothschild, and Albert Lord Grey. Others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Group. Thus, the central part of the secret society was established March 1891. It continued to function as a formal group through the outer circle, was apparently not organized until 1909 to 1913, which was around the period of NAACP, Urban League, the rise of the Boule, etc. This group was able to get access to Rhodes' money after his death in 1902, and also to the funds of loyal Rhodes supporters like Alfred Bett and Sir A. Bailey. With this backing, they sought to extend and execute the ideals of Rhodes and to obtain from Ruskin and Steed. Milner was the chief Rhodes trustee, and Parkin was the organizing secretary of the Rhodes Trust after 1902, etc., etc., etc. I won't hold you no longer tonight. Thank you all. Thank you. There's more, but there just ain't enough time. Again, next week, it would help for those of you who come, if you could just come earlier. If I could get started just a little earlier, I can finish a little earlier. I know y'all used to me being here real late, but I could start earlier.
How about 6 o'clock?
No, 6 o'clock. No, it won't be 6 o'clock. I'd like to be able to start at 7:30. If I can start at 7:30, I'd appreciate it. Instead of 7:45, 8.